Hi, this is Maddi. Cheers. Welcome to Radical Democracy. We are actually live in the studio today after a couple of weeks of having to phone things in. So you guys can call in or text in or comment at 516-945-9099. That's the call-in number. You can also hear us on the TuneIn app live. We're live. So one more time, if you want to call in, it's 516-945-9099, and we are on Facebook Live also. So thank you for joining us. So last week, we talked about courage. We talked about heroes. We talked about the fact that a lot of these terms lately have been diluted because they've been used over and over and over again. So I am very happy to welcome my husband, Bob, here today, Robert Vetter, author and anthropologist. And one of the other terms that we found that's been diluted lately is the term warrior. I see all the time quotes or admonitions in advertising: be a warrior, being a warrior, being a hero, having true courage is something that's not that easily achieved. It's not something to be thrown around in an ad. It's not something to be tossed about as if it has very little meaning. These terms have a great deal of meaning. And because we've diluted them, because we're in this time in our country that's very divisive, where people seem to want to take sides and not come together, each side sort of has this idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we're making alliances with people who are neither heroic or courageous, and in many cases, they are people we would formerly be disgusted by, except that we've chosen sides, we've created enemies, and we've demonized people. And so we've forgotten what these terms mean. We've forgotten, as we discussed last week, that the obligation of a hero is not to themselves, it's to the community at large. And often these heroes go on arduous journeys. Often they do a lot of soul searching before they can even present themselves to the community in a new form. And all of that takes great courage to bring those lessons humbly to the forefront. So if you're out there fighting for some cause and you're making an alliance with somebody just because you want to defeat somebody else, that doesn't make you a warrior. It might make you a soldier in an army of other people who are also fighting against egotists and serving that particular god. Then that's okay. I mean, you can certainly make that choice, but I think it's time to understand what these terms really mean. So I want to thank one more time my husband for joining me, and I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about the path of the true warrior.
Thank you, Maddi. So I'd like to personalize this first before we kind of unpack what this concept means. And in my own life, I kind of came to that on the back end of teachings of peace, interestingly enough. And I'm going to, throughout this, we're going to kind of be working with the idea of peace and the idea of what a warrior is, because they're not necessarily antithetical to one another, and that's a lot of what I want to focus on today. So when I was a teenager, or even before teenager, I think starting at around 12, I was probably unusual compared to the other friends that I had, because I threw myself into an understanding of Hindu philosophy from very early on. And I became really interested in one of the teachings in Hindu philosophy, which is the concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence. And at one point, as a kid, I wanted ahimsa to be the main ruling feature of the way that I wanted to live. And I remember there was a day I was on the main street in my town, and there was a guy a little bit older than me that I don't even remember what it was that led to him wanting to push me around. And all I could think of was ahimsa. All I could think of was, I can't respond to this with violence. And I very consciously let him push me and push me again and push me again. And I remember thinking about that and reflecting back on it and wondering whether that was the right thing to do or not for a long time after that. And I remember getting involved in martial arts like a few years after that and thinking about martial arts as is that the opposite? If I'm training in martial arts, does that mean that I'm embracing the idea of violence? Have I abandoned this concept of ahimsa? And I think that we can look at it in a way that we embrace both of those things. So this is also on the heels of a couple of sessions that I've done here with you, Maddi, where we've talked about the teachings of peace from the Haudenosaunee. So on one level, it might seem like, well, if we're talking about the warrior's way now, isn't that the opposite of what we covered when we talked about peace? And the main principle that I'm going to suggest to you is no. These two are not antithetical to one another. These are two concepts that can be brought together through action.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to kind of go through a couple of the ways that I found this in my own life, and then we'll start to unpack the concept a little bit more deeply. So I found the warrior concept in the training that I did in martial arts. I started when I was about 15, and my teacher talked a lot to us. There were a lot of us young guys in there. And my teacher talked to us a lot about what it meant to be a warrior. I also got involved in reading Carlos Castaneda at about the same time. And in fact, I brought a few quotes from Carlos Castaneda, who talked a lot about the teachings that he received from his teacher, Don Juan. Now, since then, I have come to completely believe that nothing in these books truly happened, but I consider them delightful fiction.
Right.
And I believe that truth can be expressed in fiction. So I'm going to talk about some of those things tonight as well. Another thing that I want to look at is the life of Gandhi, and you and I have talked about Gandhi before.
Oh, absolutely.
And Gandhi is maybe the best example of a person who was absolutely committed to ahimsa, nonviolence, and absolutely a badass warrior, in my opinion.
Right.
And then I want to talk a little bit also about Plains Indians and how they've used this concept of the warrior, and most recently, the people out in North Dakota who were willing to take a stand and put it all on the line for their own rights as indigenous people, as well as defending the rights of humanity to have access to water.
Right.
So I think all of these are things that I want to look at today over the course of our time together.
Excellent. Thank you. One of the things I wanted to bring up too that you just mentioned briefly too was Gandhi, and Gandhi being a badass. And we talked a little bit about last week about this misconception by a lot of these young Marxists that somehow Stalin and Mao were badass. Like when people have, in the article I read, people talked to them about, hey, they each killed like 50 million people to get what they wanted. And they killed old people, defenseless people. They invaded countries and killed millions and millions of people. And in trying to convince these young Marxists that perhaps they weren't, that Stalin and Mao weren't really good examples of Marxist philosophy, that they were murderers akin to Hitler. But they reject the idea that they were anything akin to Hitler. And what they do say, the response was that these are badass. They look at these guys as badass, as opposed to just being bad people. So when we're talking about Gandhi as being badass, that's a whole other order of being when you're talking about what a warrior really is, as opposed to what an egomaniacal megalomaniac is.
True. So with your kind permission, what I'd like to do is to talk about a few of what I consider to be the main points of a warrior's perspective. And I'm going to do it with some direct quotes from Carlos Castaneda, who I just mentioned.
Great.
And then we can look at other examples of that.
Excellent.
So I'm going to start with one that is often quoted, and it's sort of a summary of what the other points are. So I'm not going to break this one down. I'm just going to share it as it is and use it as an introduction. So here's the quote from Carlos Castaneda. I am already given to the power that rules my fate, and I cling to nothing, so I will have nothing to defend. I have no thoughts, so I will see. I fear nothing, so I will remember myself. Detached and at ease, I will dart past the eagle to be free.
That's a really good quote. And I'm really glad that you're touching on to be free, because a lot of what's going on now is there is an attack on the concept of freedom. And I'm not talking about the idea of taking apart the Second Amendment. I'm not talking about the idea that we need some new constitutional amendments, but there is an attack on the concept of freedom, of the responsibility of freedom. And a lot of the attack on what we traditionally think of as freedom and human rights, a lot of this attack comes in the guise of security, and it also comes in reaction to the political times. And I think it also comes from a generation that was not raised to be responsible. They were raised by people who told them everything was good, everybody gets a trophy, everybody's the same, everybody, we don't want to rock the boat, we just are going to look at everybody as equal. Looking at everybody as having equal rights is very different from looking at everybody as being free and equal to and equal, having to diminish those who are excellent or who wish to excel at a certain thing. We don't want to diminish them, but because they raise all of us, and we each have that potential in us. So if we are looking at freedom, freedom requires great responsibility and can be frightening. It can be scary. So we look to other systems that make us feel more secure, and feeling like no one's better than I am at something is going to make you feel more secure, which is the mistake we've discussed on the show before that Norway's made with their system, where they don't want anybody to rise above. They don't want anybody. You can be humble and still be excellent and still master something. You don't have to be humble and mediocre. Everybody's got it in them to be a master at something. So that's where I feel like this idea of the inner warrior and the quote from Carlos Castaneda speaks directly to the idea of radical responsibility for yourself and for the community and the world that we live in.
True. And in a world that's unfair, you could say in a way that we are what they say in existentialism, I love, which is that we are condemned to our freedom.
Right.
Because whether we know it or not, whether we utilize our freedom or not, we are free, even in the most contained conditions.
Yes.
So along with that freedom comes infinite responsibility. So even in a situation that makes sense, even in a situation that is not of my doing, I still have responsibility.
Right.
And the responsibility that I have transcends me as an individual. My responsibility is to the people around me who I'm willing to put it on the line for. So that's definitely one of the aspects of the path of the warrior that I want to talk about. Another one is the idea of discipline, that the warrior's path is a disciplined path, because things don't come easily. Things come through great effort. And again, I have a quote that I'd like to use. Castaneda uses the term impeccability over and over again. And it's kind of this idea that I don't have to be perfect, but the warrior's way is to be impeccable, to be
Brilliant. Love that.
completely committed and completely united to with one's actions. So here's the quote. I like this one. Impeccability begins with a single act that has to be deliberate, precise, and sustained. If that act is repeated long enough, one acquires a sense of unbending intent, which can be applied to anything else. If that is accomplished, the road is clear. One thing will lead to another until the warrior realizes his full potential. And clearly he means his or her here.
Yes, exactly. And that concept of being impeccable is what keeps us from being hypocritical. I think one of the biggest problems we face in our culture right now is hypocrisy. We have people who want to defend women's rights, but on the other hand, only their version of women's rights. They don't want to hear everybody's voice. We have people who want to defend human rights, but only their version of human rights. They only want to condemn the people they have determined are the enemy. They only want to demonize those people that are they see as their particular enemy. When if you're going to talk about human rights, you're going to have to talk about everyone who is violating human rights, not just the group or the country that you've decided is the one that's against you. And that's to me also, that's one of the differences between being a soldier and a warrior. The soldier acts on ego and joins a group. I'm here to be part of this group. And the warrior is a very different thing. And that concept of impeccability is brilliant to me because it is the answer to following the path of hypocrisy, which so many people are doing today. It seems to me, it's obvious to me, but maybe I'm the only one. Go ahead.
The next one that I wanted to talk about is the concept of death as an advisor. And you and I have talked about this personally, but I'll mention it here, which is that we live in a society where people, the topic of death is avoided at all costs. And in the process, we act as if there is no such thing as death.
Right.
But when we accept death as inevitable, we find a certain wisdom in it. And so here again is another quote from Castaneda, one that I think is worth mentioning. A warrior must focus his attention on the link between himself and his death. Without remorse or sadness or worrying, he must focus his attention on the fact that he does not have time and let his acts flow accordingly. He must let each of his acts be his last battle on earth. Only under those conditions will his acts have their rightful power. Otherwise, they will be, for as long as he lives, the acts of a fool.
Exactly. That is a brilliant quote because I think that's exactly what happens right now. Exactly going back to hypocrisy and what we're seeing where people are calling this group or this person a bully, and in the name calling, they're being the bully. So if you recognize, I think you combine that impeccability of action with what you're talking about, your recognition that you're going to die. You're just not here that long. What do you want your life to be like? I remembered years ago, we once listened to that professor talking about ethics, and he was talking about how most people spend more time trying to figure out what car they're going to buy than what kind of life they want to live. And the other thing about facing death is it makes us think about our legacy. What is it that we want to leave behind? Not everybody is going to be the known hero, the famous hero. Gandhi didn't start out to be famous. Martin Luther King didn't start out to be famous. This was not their goal. Their goal was to help humanity, to help their people in particular. And through having such a clear-cut mission and a clear-cut goal and being impeccable and knowing that they could die in the action, both of them most definitely knew that. Both of them were assassinated, ultimately. But both of them were willing to take that risk in order to do the thing that was not just the right thing to do, but the higher thing to do. and bring to all of us, they both change the world. And that's one of the reasons I did the show on heroes, is because we have all the wrong heroes. When we dilute these ideas of heroism, of courage, of being a warrior, we dilute the people we're holding up as role models. If we as women are going to model ourselves after men, we've been spending so long saying, oh, we have to have power like men have. Why aren't we looking at Gandhi and King and Jesus and Buddha? Why aren't we looking at those men as role models? And there are everyday heroes all around us that are impeccable, that are willing to lay down their life for something or someone. But we call everybody a hero. And then we tell everybody go out there and be a warrior, and we never define for people what those terms mean. So I want to really thank you for that. That's excellent.
So if you have no time, if you have infinite time, there's no need to act.
Right.
But if you have finite time and you're looking at death as your own advisor, that's the admonition to take action.
Exactly.
So another one that talks about this notion of time is this one, this quote: "Warriors compress time. This is a principle in the art of stalking. Even an instant counts. In a battle for your life, a second is an eternity that may decide the outcome. Warriors aim at succeeding. Therefore, they compress time. Warriors don't waste an instant."
Exactly.
So again, if we say that this may be my last act on earth, how would I act? How would I act differently if this is my last moments on earth compared to the delusion that I have infinite time in front of me?
Right. And I think that may be one of the most important switches to flip in your consciousness, and we have talked about that a lot. And of course, with the studies on different cultures and the way they look at death, and looking at the world in a much broader perspective, going beyond the Western version of denying death and this quest for immortality that we seem to have, then it makes it so that you're going to do that inner search. I think that's a lot of it. I know that it takes great courage to walk that inner path first, to find out who you are, what your gift is, honor that, and then you can be a warrior for that. Then that is your cause. That is what you want to do. Give people voice, if that's what it is. And that should be part of the goal, I think, for a warrior, is to allow someone else to speak their truth. And so a warrior, to me, is interested in all truths. A warrior is not trying to shut someone down or shut someone up. And a warrior certainly isn't using as one of his or her tactics making fun of others and belittling others and trying to shut them up in that way. So the whole warrior concept is diluted when we put up people as our heroes or as warriors who act exactly like that, who are simply bullies.
Well, a warrior is the opposite of a bully.
Exactly.
Another idea is the lack of, or the idea that I am not a victim, and eliminating self-pity.
Yes.
And so rather than being tossed about on the circumstances that surround me, that I am capable of maintaining regardless of what happens. And here's another quote that I like that kind of makes that example. The basic difference between an ordinary man and a warrior is that a warrior takes everything as a challenge, while an ordinary man takes everything as a blessing or as a curse.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It is, because if you think about it, it is the acceptance of my current circumstances, not that they have to be okay,
Right.
but that I have to understand this is what I'm dealing with right now. So what he's really saying here is that the average man can analyze each moment and say, well, is this a blessing for me or is this a curse for me? And in either case, it's saying that I am the result of my circumstances instead of saying that I have volition, I have human will that I can apply towards my circumstances, which is this notion of challenge.
Exactly.
The idea that life is to be lived as a challenge.
Exactly. And I think that when you're looking at something as a challenge, when that is your perspective, that was kind of like what Mother Teresa said when she said, I will not go to any anti-war march, but I will show up for any pro-peace rally. It means you're fighting for something. When you're constantly fighting against something, you are a victim. You are making decisions, you are taking paths, and you are making choices based on what somebody else is doing, as opposed to saying, here's my solution. I think you've got it wrong, which is okay to say, but here's my solution. This is what I'm willing to fight for. This is what I'm willing to die for. And like Mother Teresa, that was her whole point, is in that simple statement, is that you fight for something. You can fight for peace, like what we were talking about. And the way to do it is the way Gandhi and King and Jesus did it and Buddha did it, is that you are that example too. You are that example. And it's also the understanding that if you did have to get into a physical conflict, like the Haudenosaunee, where they cut their hair, if they are going to enter a physical conflict to show they are diminished, they have cut off their connection to the Creator, to the life force, to the creative force that is our spirit among all of us, that they will have to go out and kill somebody. And then the recognition that they will have to be healed to come back in. But they are warriors fighting for something because they recognize how terrible this is. And I think that I remember reading about the Thumb Wars when you're talking about not being a victim. The Thumb Wars happened under Mao when he decimated the Buddhist temples. I don't know if you remember this, but he decimated Buddhist temples. He did it again when he invaded Tibet. And they cut off the thumbs of all of the monks so that they couldn't use their malas to pray, or so he thought. They were then doing manual labor. They were digging roads. They were the harshest kind of labor is what they set these monks to with no thumbs. And they would eat once a day, which as monks they were kind of used to, but still not the kind of good food, nutritious things they were used to. But what these monks did was, even though they were living in caves, they were on cots that they had one blanket, is they took threads, the younger ones who apparently still had their thumbs, it was definitely the older ones that had all their thumbs cut off. They took threads and knotted the threads into malas. And the older ones who couldn't even hold that would make a motion and continue the prayer silently. They would use the one candle that had been given to the whole cave and sit in circle after the soldiers had gone to sleep, and put their candle out in the center, surrounded by each other in circle, and do their prayers. And people like that don't look at themselves as being victimized. And I remember in the story I read, which was written by one of the younger monks that had been captured at that time and who had not had his thumbs cut off, was he was talking about how he had been feeling so sorry for himself, and he didn't know how he was going to survive this until the first night he was thrown in the cave, and that's what he saw. And that's exactly the kind of warrior spirit, that heroic spirit that you're talking about.
It also brings up the notion that we can use the term warrior in two different senses. One is the literal sense of war, and when a person goes to war, they put it all on the line. And as we said, the warrior, the true warrior versus the soldier, the warrior is the one who has a purpose behind being there and putting it on the line. The soldier is somebody who follows the directives of somebody else blindly.
Exactly.
So that's one level. That's the literal level of the warrior as somebody who puts it all on the line by going into battle. But then we can also use it in a metaphorical sense, in which case the warrior is somebody who is engaged in the battle with oneself, with one's own limitations, with one's own ego in the smallest sense of the word.
Exactly. And that, I think, relates to what you said about eliminating self-pity. That is essential, I think, to becoming a warrior, because a lot of what I see going on today is, and not that it hasn't gone on before, but everybody blames. It's your fault. This is what we see in a divided society. It's very clear. Everybody's out there blaming somebody. If you're blaming somebody else for your situation, you are in a state of self-pity. You are pitying yourself. And you're blaming somebody else only causes them to turn around and blame you. So there's no solution. There's no overcoming. There's no finding your higher self or the higher ground or the common ground, which could be the higher ground. And that I really see that in our country today. We really are at this point where people don't even want to listen to centrists, even though polls show that most of the country is still pretty good with the middle way. The people that are making all the noise are not. And they're the people, like the squeaky wheel thing, that are getting all the attention. So people are aligning themselves with these extremes. And the way they align is to take on self-pity, to be hypocritical, and not to make the inner journey. And I do think all warriors make that inner hero's journey as well as whatever their external hero journey is.
Exactly. The next one that I wanted to talk about is the theme of non-attachment and the art of letting go. So this one says, a warrior is a hunter. He calculates everything. That's control. Once his calculations are over, he acts. He lets go. That's abandon. A warrior is not a leaf at the mercy of the wind. No one can push him. No one can make him do things against himself or against his better judgment. A warrior is tuned to survive, and he survives in the best of all possible fashions.
And that's exactly what what I was talking about earlier with I see so many people aligning with people that we formerly thought of as despicable, but they're the enemy of my enemy. So we're going to make this alliance here, and the enemy of my enemy is now my friend, which of course is never, ever true, because as soon as you defeat the enemy you're both against, that guy over there is going to stab you right in the back if he's got the opportunity, or she's got the opportunity.
So we have this idea of positive non-attachment as opposed to detachment, and it's an important concept in Asian thought. That sometimes Asian thought, meaning largely Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, has been characterized by Western
and Confucianism.
thought. Yes, has been characterized by Western thought as being based on this notion of detachment. And detachment kind of suggests that nothing matters, and that's not what we're talking about here. Right. The theme of positive non-attachment is the idea that there is a part in our living where we have to critically decide what's important. And at that time, there is something that is extremely important. But once we determine what that is, and once we begin the next step, which is the step of action, there's no turning back. So that eliminates the self-doubt that puts somebody in their own way.
Exactly.
So positive non-attachment becomes acting without second thought. The thinking has already gone into the front end. So the back end of action requires no thought whatsoever. And it's acting in a way that is not attached to the outcome.
That's perfect. That is a perfect description of why these sort of knee-jerk reactions that we're seeing to things, this sort of constant obsession with with certain people, with certain ideas, and an instantaneous reaction to what someone is doing is precisely the opposite of the warrior, precisely the opposite of courage and heroism, and precisely the opposite of what we should be doing now to come up with some solutions. So, and anybody can set us off. It just takes one sentence, one tweet, one talking head on some ridiculous news show. It's just there was a post recently that went around on Walter Cronkite, and it was aimed at being funny because it talked about how, there used to be this guy who, just read the news. He didn't blame somebody. He didn't promote somebody. He just read the news as it happened, and we all got to make up our own minds. And that is essential, and you cannot do that. You cannot make up your own mind if you are emotionally constantly reacting to something that somebody says. Sometimes it's you have to rein in. Sometimes you have to rein in yourself, not the other person. And that's what I love about the statement that you just read, that there's that preparatory time that is taken, that calculated time, and then you act. And once you've made that decision to act, then you see what the outcome is. Mm-hmm. And then that might mean you need to prepare again and act again.
Right. And it's based on a pure awareness, pure perception.
Yes.
So here's another quote that I think supports that. When nothing is for sure, we remain alert, perennially on our toes. It is more exciting not to know which bush the rabbit is hiding behind than to behave as if we knew everything.
Oh, I love that quote. I love that. I'm going to post that every day. I think. Honest, could you read that one more time, please,
Sure.
Listeners?
When nothing is for sure, we remain alert, perennially on our toes. It is more exciting not to know which bush the rabbit is hiding behind than to behave as though we knew everything.
Exactly. And that's what's happening now. We've gone to this space of I'm right and you're wrong. I'm right and you're wrong. And it's all about do we know everything? There was another quote that came up a few weeks ago that went around for a while where this woman said, "Be teachable. You're not always right." And I think that what's happening a lot is that people are not teachable. Warriors are teachable. Warriors observe. Warriors listen. Mm-hmm. And warriors respect and understand. And certainly, if you're going to go into battle, you'd better understand your enemy, not react, but understand exactly who and what you are facing. And that also requires absolute honesty and integrity. That impeccability that you talked about earlier.
So the point is that there's a time for thinking and there's a time for acting.
Right.
So the average person, I would say, spends most of the time thinking, obsessively thinking, in loops that just keep going. But the warrior thinks critically and then acts. So most of the time is spent on action and less time is spent on thinking about that action, which is why this one makes sense to me as well. What we need to do to allow magic to get hold of us is to banish doubts from our minds. Once doubts are banished, anything is possible.
That's really true. And I think, I actually think this just popped into my head when you were reading that. One of the things that helps you banish doubt is to ask yourself, does this support life? Mm-hmm. Am I taking this action based on love? Am I taking this action based on what supports life?
And that's the time for the critical thinking.
Exactly. And does it support growth, my growth, someone else's growth, my children's growth? Those are all questions that are part of that critical thinking before the action takes place, as opposed to living in that constant state of reaction, which means somebody else is in control of you.
Mm-hmm. And then again, looking at how attachment becomes the problem here. When one has nothing to lose, one becomes courageous. We're only timid when there is something we can still cling to.
Oh, beautiful.
So I think this gives us kind of a formula for the concept of the warrior, and we can kind of return to Gandhi, I think, now that we've looked at all of those and see how that really describes his life.
Yes, absolutely.
That he spent time critically thinking about what's important in life. He committed himself to the concept of ahimsa. I remember one time somebody said to him that he was a true yogi because he had attained they didn't use the word enlightenment, but he had attained self-realization because he must clearly have gone through all of these steps of a yogi. And his response was, no, I never even got past ahimsa. I've spent my whole life just on that one step along the way. So it was kind of a humble response, but
Right.
but it also spoke to his level of commitment and how important it was to have that ahimsa, that nonviolence, be a part of his action. So he put all the time into acting, into learning, understanding what was important, and what was important to him was the liberation of his people. And he did it through this ancient path of knowledge, this old way of thinking. And then when it came to the action, what did he do? He put it all on the line.
Exactly. Yes, he put it all on the line non-violently. And that is the part that people miss. And the same thing with Martin Luther King. When I read the review of that book, which I couldn't find the name of the book, but it was reviewed in the New York Times Book Review a couple of weeks ago. But the man was writing the book about how these new social movements have no depth. Basically, what he's saying is that they're a mile wide and an inch deep. Because to have some sort of protest on social media, you can do that in 5 minutes, and 1 million people are listening to you. And they don't even care if you're telling them the truth or not. If it hits them emotionally, again, in reaction like that, they're your supporters. There's a huge movement going on. And they're not bothering with doing the research, doing the critical thinking that will go, am I joining this movement or am I not joining this movement? Is this something I want to be a part of? And the gentleman's point, and I will try and find out the name of the book, but the gentleman's point was that when you looked at Martin Luther King, at the original civil rights movement, they started in 1955, gathering people quietly in secret, training people to be nonviolent, to resist the violence they knew was coming, that they knew this was going to happen. So Martin Luther King, all of the people involved in the original civil rights movement, and they didn't attempt a march until 1963. And now, in 6 minutes, as opposed to 8 years, we can have some kind of nonsense going on, being bullying people, being nasty, not even committing to the depth that the people who followed Gandhi or the people who followed King or the people who followed Jesus were committed to. That, and I'm not bringing up Jesus, as you know, as a religious figure, regardless of how you feel about him as a religious figure. Even if you're just looking at him as a man, he was a revolutionary. Mm-hmm. He was a revolutionary who spent years before he took his first step, years training to be a rabbi, years of critical thinking, obviously, to go against some of his own people, and then to go against people who were so much more powerful than anybody, to go against the Romans. I mean, when you look at these examples of what real heroes are, when you look at the examples of Malala Yousafzai that we mentioned last week, the woman who was shot in the head by the Taliban and continued, even after that, managed to survive and continues to go around the world working towards getting girls educated. Or you look at Nadia Murad, who is who was this past year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, who overcame tremendous psychological and physical trauma from having been a sex slave and set up Nadia's initiative so that she can go end this. She is putting her life on the line. They have both had death threats because of who they are coming up against. And yet, I don't see them invited to speak. This is a very curious thing that I'm going to deal with more at another time. But this whole idea that we have the wrong heroes. We see people like Linda Sarsour invited to speak at NYU, who is aligned with Louis Farrakhan, who is a racist and an anti-Semite who said horrible things. You know, we hear her say, "I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-termite." And we hear her and the people following her misrepresenting things, misrepresenting facts, never in their and I am not saying that there aren't human rights violations going on between Israel and the Palestinians, but you never hear her talk about the idea that Israel is also the only country where women have equal rights. And on the other side, and she's a woman, on the other side of that, we have Hamas running Palestine. And Hamas does not believe in equal rights for women. That there was a Palestinian woman who is in the fight to get human rights for the Palestinians, but she was also talking about how she is in the fight to get back the rights for women, that Hamas has set them back decades. So we have taken to ourselves these heroes that are really they're not heroes. They're just agitating us. They're just working on our emotions, and they're not telling the truth. And one thing a hero always does is tell the truth. This is the truth of my action, and that's part of that critical thinking. If you're going to talk about what would just as an example of, because like I said, Linda Sarsour invited to speak at NYU, Malala and Nadia not invited. Malala hasn't been invited to speak anywhere in the United States in 2 years, which is very interesting also. But when you look at an issue like that, when you're talking about this very real issue between Israel and the Palestinians, and now what we're talking about is creating one state. What is that going to look like? Hamas is not pro-democracy, and they're not pro-women. They do not think women should have equal rights, and Israel does. They do not believe in democracy, and Israel does. So if we're going to make them one state, what would that look like? But instead, we just listen to people who are spouting off, who are stirring up our feelings and causing us to react. And on top of that, we're believing them. We're not thinking for ourselves. We're not doing the research. We're not reading the articles. And so this is the problem in throwing around these words. She's a hero. He has courage. She's a warrior. In throwing around these words and labeling anybody with these words, bestowing upon them the high honor that was once reserved for people like Gandhi, we diminish the role models we are giving to our children. And we diminish ourselves in the process. So somebody has to define these things again.
True. Well, I wanted to use one more example from recently in the news, and that's to talk about the people who were fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great example of warrior teachings. So the Plains Indians had really taken this concept of the warrior to a high level of art, I guess I would say. And as we've discussed before, Plains Indian warfare was very, very different, a very different concept than Europeans and later Americans would bring to this land. The European notion of war was the idea that your purpose, your goal, was to annihilate the enemy,
right.
was to destroy everyone, destroy every last person on the other side. Whereas the Plains concept of a warrior was very different. The traditional Plains Indian concept of a warrior was that the battlefield was a place for that warrior to test his mettle against another warrior.
Right.
That there was no reason to go after innocent women, children, and elders.
Exactly.
That a war would take place between two warriors, not two, but I mean ultimately however many there were. And that's why the whole concept of counting coup is such an amazing look at true bravery. So rather than the goal being to kill every last person, it's to put it on the line for me and see what I can do out on the battlefield. So in many ways, I like to describe Plains Indian warfare as being akin to war games, because different acts gave you a different number of points on the battlefield. And probably the best example of that is what's called counting coup. So in counting coup, I take my weapons, my weapons of death, and I put those down and go out onto the battlefield armed with nothing but a coup stick. And so on my approach, my enemy has the opportunity to kill me, to use weapons that can kill me in an instant. But if I drop all my weapons, go out with my coup stick, and I touch or strike my enemy with that stick, it's the ultimate act of bravery. And in the agreement of an understanding of what that true test is all about, my enemy is supposed to acknowledge the fact that I defeated him in that moment without causing him harm. And he's supposed to walk off the battlefield knowing that he was defeated, that he was armed and his opponent wasn't.
Amazing. Can you imagine?
And I think that's a great model of what it really is to put it on the line as a warrior.
Absolutely. It is the ultimate model. I agree. I just want to thank you, Celia, for listening, and also to say for a warrior, Celia wrote in, more time is spent on constructive action instead of emotional reaction. Warriors are willing to learn. People, do your own research. Don't just blindly follow along if this is a goal that you're seeking to reach. Thank you, Celia.
Good. And then just the last, I know we're near the end of our session together. I just wanted to mention that as Plains Indian people, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota were continuing this tradition in their opposition to the government and to the corporation behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, when they nonviolently stood in protest.
Exactly.
And when thousands of Native people from around the country came, and even people who were originally enemies of one another, they agreed that this was a place to draw a line in the sand, that they were willing to put it on the line in a nonviolent way. So even though they were attacked with rubber bullets in the middle of the winter in miserably cold temperatures, they were shot at with what do they call those hoses? The cannon hose.
Yeah, cannon hoses.
Cannon hoses.
Yeah,
the
water cannons.
Water cannons. That's right. So they were frozen out there. They to me are true warriors.
Exactly. Who did their critical thinking, who had facts and science and heart and spirit marching into battle with them. So it wasn't like the reason I think that those particular actions drew so many people in was because of that level of love and commitment for their people and for the whole world, for anyone who needs water to survive, which would be all of us. And because they were willing to not be violent, because they followed the path of Gandhi, because they followed the path of ahimsa, they had so much more power, because that kind of commitment and that kind of power is exponentially more powerful than just running off and tweeting something or writing something on Facebook or acting like a bully to stop bullying. There's no power in that. There's no energy in that. And that was the word I meant to use. So exponentially more can be achieved if you follow this true path of the warrior, not what you see on TV advertising a pair of Nikes, or advertising something. It's just sad that we have diluted these terms, and I'm hoping that we can bring them back to where they should be. So that brings us close to the end of our time. We have a few more minutes, so I just want to ask you if there's anything you'd like to close with or any last words you'd like to say on this whole concept of being a warrior.
Well, you know what? Having explored all of these themes, I think I'd like to reread that first passage again now that we've kind of unpacked it and looked at what it is to be a warrior, because I think this one really sums it up so well.
I agree.
And gives us an actionable concept. I am already given to the power that rules my fate, and I cling to nothing, so I will have nothing to defend. I have no thoughts, so I will see. I fear nothing, so I will remember myself. Detached and at ease, I will dart past the eagle to be free.
And I love that quote. And I also love that we use the Plains Indians example that we talk about. I love what Tom Porter said, where one of the things that Tom Porter always says about what makes things not work, even democracy or going for peace, Tom Porter, the Mohawk elder that we work with, is if it doesn't have a sense of spirituality to it. And it was the same thing when I was reading about Buddhist economics today again. He said the same thing, is that with that, and that's not, spirituality is not talking about believing in God or a God, but having that connection with something that is bigger than you. And all of these good things, all of the things we talk about, this lack of self-pity, this impeccability, when we look to these great heroes, whether you see them as gods or you see them as men and women, if you look to these people, these are your role models. And
Exactly.
we don't, and it's a crime to put those types of people in the same category as somebody who is just mouthing off for their own benefit or trying to get something for their own ego. So I want to thank you so
pleasure.
much. I want to thank Bobby. Thank you, Bobby, my wonderful producer, for getting everything here. And thank you to everyone who's listening. And if you didn't get a chance to listen, I hope you're listening now. Because it will be archived on all of the shows on Radical Democracy are archived on Strong Island Radio, and listen to all their wonderful shows. Give Strong Island TV a look. It's terrific stuff. Wonderful things are going on here. And thank you so much again. Peace, love, have fun. Thank you.